Welcome back to part 2 of What If Harry Potter Became the Dread Pirate of the Caribbean? Get ready for more magic, mayhem, and high seas adventure as Harry sails deeper into the pirate's life. Let's dive in. Alright, your reaction time is great, and you clearly know how to dodge. Barbossa noted, as he faced off against his captain and allowed his rapier to start twitching through the air. They were training him in the use of his khopesh blades up by the forward bow, and all the crew members that were not busy following Adewale's directives for sailing the ship had gathered to watch. Now, continued the older man, noticing where his captain was looking, you're watching my eyes, which is a great way to get yourself killed. He raised the basket hilt of his weapon to show how his hand moved it to and fro, your opponent's wrist be from whence the attack is born. It is the past tense, from whence it cannot separate itself. The end of the blade, where the attack arrives, is its present tense, and this too cannot be denied. Watch both the wrist and the tip of the blade or you're dead. Harry thought about that for a moment before getting into his ready stance, body sideways to his opponent, one sword extended between them, and the other held back with the tip to the ground, ready for rapid movement. How am I supposed to watch two spaces in time while also keeping track of other foes, the terrain, and my own weapons? Though he was picking the skill up quickly by his first mate's estimation, the weight of two swords in his hands was taking some getting used to. Practice. Hector smirked, now on guard. He jabbed with his own weapon and smiled as his captain nimbly leapt to the side of the attack before launching one of his own with a slash to his hand that he quickly parried before having to dance out of the way of the second weapon's path. Back and forth they went, and as the younger man began to get comfortable with the rhythm, Barbossa began to pick up the speed of the thrusts, swipes, and parries, forcing his young captain to think on his feet, react in an instant, and start swinging his own weapons at greater speed as he got a feel for them. Training by doing was the only way Barbossa knew, and by thunder it worked. By the end of the session Harry was a panting and sweaty mess, covered in cuts and small stabs to non-vital areas, but he was smiling as if he'd just entered his cabin and found a mountain of treasure waiting for him. That was awesome. He got out before collapsing against the front mast. The crew cheered at the sight and Maddie ran at once to her savior's side with Dobby popping into existence next to her with a box of medical equipment. Her worry was clear to see as she fretted over the captain, but her hands were sure as the bandages were laid out and the wounds cleaned. Between her expertise, and the elf's magic, he was patched up in no time and feeling no pain at all as he slid his swords back into the wide sash he'd wrapped around his waist for the purpose. Thank you, both. I'll be at the helm. As the Brit moved off, Barbossa took note of the slight swagger developing in his stride that meant he was finally gaining his sea legs. He was about to head on over to inspect the progress of the rigging crews when Adewale and several other freed slaves made their way over to him and led him to the railing. Barbossa. Adewale. We are following that Hornigold man to Nassau, yes? Barbossa nodded to the ships ahead of them whose wakes they were riding easily through. That's right. We'll give the crew some time on shore, gold to spend, and set up a presence in the developing pirate republic while we plan our next hunt. Good. The others nodded, though it was clear they had something on their minds. There's something you need to bring up with me? The others shared a look before pointedly taking note of where Maddie was on the deck as she made her way back down to her infirmary on the second level. Clearly they were making sure she wasn't close enough to overhear. The men and I were hoping to do something special for the captain for saving us from bondage. Hornigold's man, Teach, mentioned that Nassau had some very interesting facilities, and we were hoping to use some of our share of the gold to purchase a gift for Captain Harry upon arrival. That be mighty thoughtful, Adewale. Barbossa noted. What did you have in mind? When the larger man explained the crew's intention, the older man couldn't help but laugh out loud with mirth. Oh yes, Harry would certainly enjoy that gift. Who wouldn't? It took about a day to reach their destination, and when they did, it took all of Harry's considerable willpower not to stare and salivate at the location laid out before him in the bay. A pirate colony. A real fucking pirate colony lay before him, and it was a dream come true. The cove that the Freedom and Hornigold ships pulled into was a bustling hive of activity with dozens of vessels either offloading pillaged cargo, or loading it back up to be sold in other ports for a profit. On the beach were visible several paths leading up to either a lush forest and large fort or an impressively sized town for the limited scope of the island's size. It was everything the wizard had dreamed of since he was a small child hiding in the library and imagining a life of adventure. Are ye all right there, lad? Barbossa asked as he made his way up to him. The helms will seem to be the captain's favorite place, as it was there that he could always be found if someone went looking. I'm just enjoying the view. Harry spun them level in a free space, and with a quick command a couple of crew members dropped the forward and rear anchors to hold them in place. I always dreamed of this place in its prime. Is it holding up to your imaginings? That and more, Hector. That and more. As Harry spoke, a loud hoot caught his attention, and he looked up just in time to catch Hedwig on his arm. She dutifully held out a letter for him on her claw and then hopped on over to his right shoulder. She seemed to get the whole pirate bird thing without even needing to be prompted. What's that? Oh, I sent Hedwig over to the Marianne to ask when Hornigold and the other colony founders would be willing to meet with me. Hornigold actually named his ship the Marianne? Barbossa inquired. Didn't Black Caesar say that was the name of his third ex-wife? The one who tried to unman him with a spoon? Apparently the man has a unique sense of humor. Anyway, this says they can meet us tonight somewhere called Guthrie's Pub, so that gives us plenty of time to show our crew a good time beforehand, eh? Sounds like a plan. I think a few of the men have a surprise for you too, lad. Really? Yes. How many should we leave behind to guard the ship? None. None? None. Dobby. The elf popped into existence before them and Harry asked, would you be okay with staying here and watching over the ship? The little being bobbed his head happily. Yes, sir, Captain Harry, sir. It'd be giving Dobby time to clean out the infirmary. Ms. Maddie be refusing to let Dobby organize the shelves the right way. He huffed dramatically at the perceived silliness of humans. Harry winced at the thought of messing with a healer's territory in any regard. Might want to hold off on that one, buddy. Say, is there anything you'd like me to pick up for you on the shore? Master would willingly get Dobby a gift? You're my friend, Dobby. Of course I would. The wizard had to stop talking for a moment as his little pal leapt onto his knees and wrapped them in a hug for a few moments before eventually releasing him. Dobby would like a new pair of socks and a pig. The crew says they not be having it before and it will be fun to let them try something new. The elf began to hop in place with delight at the thought. Laughing lightly at his antics, Harry answered, that's easy, bud. I'll have those for you when we get back. And so it was that the crew of the Freedom stocked themselves up with gold to a man from the hold, loaded themselves up into the ship's boarding craft, that managed to fit a lot more people each than should have been physically possible, and rowed themselves to shore. Upon landing on the beach, Harry instructed them all to return by morning at the latest, and the crew went their separate ways. Some traveled along the beach to take in the sights, others went into the forest for who knew what reason, some went to gather supplies, and a few started traveling with Harry and Barbossa up the street into the town itself. Maddie made to go with them, but for some reason several of the other women quickly took her arms and dragged her away, giggling all the while. Strange. The wizard was just trying to decide where to go and explore first when his first mate pointed to a particular building ahead. Captain, that sign do be saying Guthrie's Pub. Perhaps we go and check it out before tonight to get the lay of the land, as it were? Good idea, Hector. As Harry led the way inside, Barbossa stealthily gestured to Adewale, who smirked and took his men with him back off into the town. Thanks to the suggestions of their first mate, they had a surprise to set up. Inside, the pub was dimly lit with several tables spread out across the space and a wide bar stretching across the entire back wall. Behind said bar was a severely attractive blonde woman with her hair tied back, and sat in front of her, likely placing his drink order, was a surprisingly well-dressed fellow with an upper-crust English accent. Yes, I'll have whatever fine brandy you have on tap, and why hello there. The man proclaimed happily to Harry as the younger man took a seat next to him, making sure not to ruffle the clearly expensive frills on the other man's cuffs. Harry said nothing, merely alternating his gaze between the woman and her patron. A bit disconcerted by the lack of response, the man tried again. I say, hello there. Still no response. I am Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, don't you know, and I'm relatively new to this fine island. Might I make your acquaintance? Instead of answering, the wizard looked at the woman and raised an eyebrow. She got the message well enough as she said, my name is Eleanor Guthrie. I own the place, and if you're a pirate like you look, then you'll want to be a bit more cordial. I don't tolerate chaos in my pub. Harry nodded his understanding before gesturing to Barbossa. This be Captain Harry, or Silent Harry as some do be calling him, and I be his first mate, Hector Barbossa. We're meeting Captain Hornigold here tonight, so we thought we might have a drink first and do some exploring. Eleanor raised a brow at that piece of information. If the new guy was meeting with Hornigold personally, then he had to be something special. In fact, the man himself had ordered several kegs to be brought out later that night for a big announcement. Perhaps this man was a part of it? What can I get you? As I said before, brandy, Bonnet declared happily. Ale. Barbossa ordered. Rum. Harry answered, having always wanted to try the stuff. The drinks were served, the men enjoyed their confections, And all the while Harry and his first mate listened to Steed carry on about his adventurous travels across the sea to reach Nassau. If you could call avoiding a series of obvious English patrols adventures. Apparently he'd been a wealthy plantation owner who had felt the call of adventure in his middle years and had thus purchased himself a ship, a rarity for pirates, procured a crew, and sailed off into the unknown for his own chance at high seas infamy. Of course Harry already knew all about this from his readings as a child, but it was still fun for him to hear the tale straight from the horse's mouth. He seemed a pleasant enough sort, so he made a mental note to remind the dapper man to stay the hell away from Cape Fear River. As the Poncy blonde continued to rattle his tale, Harry started looking over the other patrons and soon took note of something that made his mouth go remarkably dry. A beautiful red-headed woman with fair pale skin and piercing blue eyes sat at a table with a boorish-looking man that seemed to be her husband based on the ring on his finger. She was dressed in a fine green dress with a pistol strapped to her waist, and based on her posture, hating her proximity to the person beside her. A few seconds later it wasn't so hard to see why, as he shoved her shoulder roughly and moved off across the room to where a few scantily clad women were lounging around a far table. He conversed with two of them for a moment, passed over a few coins, and then left the pub entirely. Had a married man just hired two prostitutes in full view of his wife? His red-headed, armed, and impossibly angry-looking, beautiful beyond measure, wife, who seemed to be about the wizard's own age. This was remarkably familiar, so familiar in fact that Harry was trying like hell to swallow the rum that had remained in his mouth after his last sip. Could this be her? According to the story, she killed her husband after doing just this and starting her career of piracy. Perhaps he could intercede here and fulfill one of his greatest fantasies, but he had to be sure. Turning rapidly back to the bar, he waved over Miss Guthrie with a finger. "Yes, oh so silent, Harry?" she snarked, earning a grin from the young pirate. He decided he liked her. "Who is that woman over there?" He gestured to the redhead who was still visibly seething. Eleanor gasped. This was the first time she'd heard Harry's voice, and it was a distinctly pleasant English baritone. Shame he didn't use it more often. "She's a newcomer here, but I think her name is Anne Bonny. From what I hear she's been trying to get accepted on a pirate crew for the last couple weeks but hasn't had any luck." "Thank you, Ms. Guthrie." Harry placed a silver mark on the bar for a tip and turned back around on his stool. "What are ye thinking, lad?" Hector asked, already able to recognize the gleam in his captain's eyes that meant his mind was working a mile a minute. "I'm thinking we're about to have a new knife hand on the ship. Hold my spot." As the lad hopped off his stool and made his way over to the woman's table, Barbossa couldn't help but laugh. He knew a fiery woman when he saw one, so if Harry succeeded, then he had a feeling life on the ship would get a hell of a lot more interesting. Meanwhile, Harry was experiencing a sense of déjà vu as he pulled out a chair and sat down across from the angry woman. "The fuck you want?" she growled, earning no reply. "I said, what do you want?" "Nothing." "Oh, I get it, you saw John moving off and thought you'd just come over here and rub it in me face that me man is leaving with those harlots? Well, I'll let you know right now that we ain't like that." Still nothing. She placed her hands on the table, meaning to shove herself up and leave, but was stopped by a long knife sliding across the surface to her hand from the stranger. "What do you want?" Harry finally spoke. "Huh? What do you want? With this life? You married John not out of love, but necessity. Your father was dying and he was going to marry you off to a snotty lawyer 20 years your senior as his final act. You needed to get out, so you convinced that sack of shit John that you had wealth, tricked him into marrying you, and used his small craft to escape the colonies to Nassau. You haven't even consummated the union, have you?" Turning paler than a ghost, Anne rasped out, "How could you possibly know all of that?" "That's not important right now. What is important is that your husband has been getting drunker, and spendier, and he's been dragging your name into the muck. I'm willing to bet he's been getting a lot more forceful and pushy lately too now that he knows his promised windfall isn't coming. What are you going to do about it?" He looked pointedly at the knife once more, and smiled as the woman took it in her hand. Pointing the tip at him she asked, "You'll still be here when I get back? This isn't over, you hear?" "I wouldn't dream of going anywhere, my dear." And hurriedly bustled out the door, and Harry experienced a full-body shudder in her absence. Up close she was even more beautiful than he'd imagined, and that Irish accent of hers was entrancing. He could see why she was considered one of the great beauties of the pirate age, and no one had scooped her up for their own cruise yet, which meant he was the first. He wouldn't deny that some of his personal time in his early years was spent imaging himself and Anne Bonny together, so he was pretty gung-ho to latch onto her before anyone else could. The redhead returned a short time later and dropped the dripping, crimson, blade onto the table before him and retaking her seat. The entire front torso of her dress was dripping with what Harry assumed was her former husband's lifeblood. What was that for? She wanted to know. An audition of sorts. Harry leaned forward and steepled his fingers together. How would you like to join my crew? Anne grew very still. I've asked to join no less than 8 different crews since arriving here and not a single one has taken me seriously. Now you show up out of nowhere, know things about me no one could possibly know, push me to finish off my deadweight, and then offer me a spot amongst your number? This makes no sense. It does if you are me. Harry smirked in what he hoped was a charming manner. I have what you might call an eye for potential, and I think you can be something big if given the right freedom and opportunity. Join my crew and you'll have plenty of both. Who knows, I might even tell you how I know those things about you. Anne thought the offer over for a minute before shrugging and nodding. All right then, not like I have any other prospects. That's the spirit. Harry slid the knife back over to her. Keep that, you're bound to have more need of it before too long. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small purse weighed down with gold coins that he tossed over to his new crewmate. And take this. What for? I ain't earned that yet. Call it an advance. Get yourself cleaned up, buy some new clothes, he gestured clearly to her ruined dress, and outfit yourself with some weapons. The Freedom is my vessel and it's docked offshore, so you can meet me back here tonight and I'll lead you back. Aye, Captain. Anne grinned before snatching up the offered items and taking her leave. This day had not gone the way she'd expected, but she was finally starting her dream of freedom and adventure. The dream her father almost destroyed by turning her into a fucking clerk in his office before trying to marry her off like a piece of property. Well, strange man or not, her new captain didn't seem inclined to hold her back that same way. Perhaps things were finally looking up for old Anne Bonny? Sitting back at the table, Harry couldn't help but groan. It should be a sin for a woman to look that good walking away from him. That groan was quickly cut short however as he found himself pulled to his feet and crushed into a side hug by Adewale. Ade, where did you come from? Town, Captain. The men have organized a little thank you for saving them and I'm to bring you to it right away. You know they didn't have to get me anything. Yes, and so do they. They wanted to, and it's the prerogative of free men to spend their money on the things they want. Now come on. Adewale waved a smirking Barbosa goodbye and practically dragged his captain out the door. Put this on first. He handed Harry a leather sack. Seriously? Do you understand the concept of a surprise? For the second time that day the wizard found himself groaning as he dutifully slid the sack over his head and allowed himself to be dragged blindly further up the street, and into a rather upscale building far and away from the slough of the poorer districts below. Adewale only stopped once to nod to the incredibly pleased mistress of the establishment before bustling his captive up the stairs to the 3rd floor and stopping before a very particular door. Half of the men and women of the crew were waiting with smiles on their faces and bated breath as the hood was removed. Hey everyone, Harry said as he blinked his eyes several times to adjust them to the light once more. What's with all of this? A gift. 2 of the women giggled at a private joke before opening the room door and pushing their captain inside by the chest. Enjoy. As one they released him and slammed the door closed in his face. For a moment Harry wondered what that was all about, until he heard a multitude of giggles behind him and slowly turned around. What faced him was a room practically filled to the brim with naked women smiling warmly at him with arms open wide in invitation. It was now very clear just what his gift from the crew was. By the gods, I love my life, Harry declared before diving into the crowd to the chorus of womanly cheers. Several hours later, Madame Hortensia entered the recently vacated best room in her brothel. The new crew on the island had been very clear that was what they wanted, and found nearly half of the girls in her employ splayed out all over the floor, groaning with clearly remembered pleasure and smiling dopily to a girl. What the hell happened here? She'd thought it a jest when the newcomers declared they wanted to give their captain a room full of flesh to enjoy. After all, what man could please that many women, let alone himself, before passing out? But this was just ridiculous. That man, Max, her best earner, and the personal escort to Lady Guthrie, said, is not a mere man. No, Serena, a blonde from the Carolinas agreed, he's a god. That tongue. Isma, a dark-skinned lass from Spain, groaned with remembered ecstasy. That night, Harry, seeing Adewale with Barbosa at the bar at Guthrie's pub, wrapped the big man in a bear hug and proclaimed, best gift ever. Chuckling merrily, the big man pulled his captain off of him and replied, aye, the crew thought you'd enjoy it. Now the Guthrie woman mentioned that the others are already here and waiting in the back room. Perfect. You 2 are with me, and let's go let them meet their king. King? Both men intoned questioningly. Well, maybe fellow lord for now. They can declare me king when they see how all the advancements I intend to bring to this place pan out. The other men clearly wanted to ask about their leader's newly revealed intentions, but were forced to fall in line as the man in question went strutting off behind the bar and into the aforementioned back room. Inside was a large circular table with 6 chairs and 4 men seated with more at their backs. 2 seats remained open, so the first was the one Harry took. His first mate and quartermaster fell in to stand behind him. "Took you long enough." Hornigold spoke jokingly from his position sat across from his latest guest before promptly standing to make introductions. "Everyone, this is Silent Harry, captain of the Freedom, and thanks to his generous sharing of the Spanish treasure fleet, and ownership of a vessel that could knock most of ours out of the water without much effort, he has joined us here at the head table. Each of us commands enough men, wealth, or destructive power to hold influence on this island, so no one should doubt Harry's qualifications to be amongst us." When no one argued, he continued, moving around the table to point people out. First was a younger man, perhaps 5 or so years older than Harry himself. He had the shadows of stubble on his chin and long lank hair held back with a blue bandana. This is Captain Jack Sparrow of the Black Pearl and his first mate James Flint. Flint, from what Harry could see of him, was a man in his 30s with a defined widow's peak and dirty blonde hair pulled back into a low tail. There was a distinct look of pride in his eyes that put the wizard in mind of former military service. "Pleasure to meet you." Sparrow nodded. The first man carried on down the line, Captain Vane of the Ranger and his first mate Jack Rackham. Vane was shorter than the others present, but he made up for the difference by being a literal brick of muscle. Rackham was thin, wiry, and he wore some of the most expensive clothing the Brit had ever seen. All he got from them was a head nod. Henry Avery, captain of the Charles II and his first mate Billy Bones. A grumble of acknowledgement came from the newly named captain. Henry Avery had a particularly bloody history as Harry recalled, but he looked like a bald plantation owner to him more than a warrior of the sea. His raised chin certainly gave him the right measure of haughtiness. Finally, Hornigold stopped at the last empty chair, and this is for Captain Edward Teach, or as the men call him, Blackbeard. Behind him, the man in question openly gasped. "Huh?" Hornigold turned and smiled at his friend. "We're already adding 1 seat to the table, why not another as well? You've certainly earned it, you have the respect of the men, and that ship we captured last month is finally refurbished enough to brave the open seas once more." The bearded man smiled wide, put his hat back on his head, and took the proffered seat as his former captain reclaimed his own. "Now introductions have been made and the head table has been updated, we can get down to business." "And what business is that?" Avery wanted to know. "The use of the Spanish gold. Harry and I have taken more than we could ever spend in our lifetimes and we still have much left over." Sparrow said, "Seems obvious to me. We give it to the men and let them enjoy being rich for a few weeks until they spend their shares completely on drink and women. Should raise morale at least." Avery intoned, "Idiot. We should use it to buy more ships and set up a legitimate trade practice on the side." Vane added, "If we're getting more ships then we should train more hunter crews to bring in more loot." The group argued heavily on the subject for several minutes until Hornigold suggested, "I would be interested to hear from Silent Harry. It is his score after all. Surely he has ideas for where the money could best be used." All eyes turned to Harry, and he waved Barbossa over to whisper in his ear. It was more important than ever to maintain an aura of mystery around such larger-than-life figures. "My captain do be saying that the gold should be invested into Nassau, but not in businesses or trading ships." Avery sneered at that remark, and what would a boy such as him know of investing, He should leave this decision to his betters. Barbossa grew very still, Adewale tensed, and both men backed slowly away from the table. That word again, both knew how much their captain hated it. And it seemed they were right to worry as the air began to grow very cold, and Harry's eyes flashed out from beneath the brim of his hat. "Say that again." His voice was a whisper that carried across the table to the bald man. "I beg your pardon." Avery huffed with self-righteous indignation at being called out. "I say the youth of today have no knowledge of when they should man their own fields and respect their betters. The very idea of a boy like him deciding how to use such wealth is laughable when wiser men like us are on hand to do so. I say again." His voice cut off in an instant as his eyes grew wide and his hands shot up to his neck, as if trying to remove some invisible obstruction. As everyone present stared on, his face began to grow increasingly red and purple before his tongue shot out of his mouth and his head began to pitch at a weird angle. Though his mouth continued to gape and gurgle, not a breath of air was released, and before long it came to an end. Whatever invisible force had been holding him up was released and his lifeless body came crashing down onto the table. All eyes turned back to Harry, who was slowly pulling his hand away from the pistol strapped to his chest. Levitation spells truly were versatile. I really hate being called a boy. His voice was chilled rage incarnate as he waved Barbossa back over to him and whispered once more in his ear, returning to his former method of communication. Right then, this unpleasantness aside, my captain has some ideas for the island going forward. The best dressed man amongst them spoke up then. Are we just going to ignore the dead captain on the table here? Or the fact that Silent Harry clearly used magic to do him in? Vane decided to answer his first mate for the table. Henry had it coming. You insult another captain like that, you should expect repercussions. Plus, I personally never liked him much anyway. The others at the table nodded their agreement. His ships and assets will be redistributed amongst our ranks for best use. As for magic, what of it? It's not like we haven't seen it before. Truly? This amazed Barbossa, who had not seen the like in his many years under the mast. Aye. Blackbeard spoke up. The seas are a magical place, prone to much mystery and sights beyond the reasoning of normal men. We've all seen things that defy mortal explanation. Black Caesar is a shaman amongst his people, and the things he can do are bloody fantastic. That aside, you mentioned Harry had thoughts on how to use the gold? Hornigold tried to bring the meeting back on track. Aye. Hector looked to his captain once more, who gave a nod. He says that what pirates have built here is a paradise, but at present it do not be one that can be sustained. Eventually the English will come back for their island, and they'll be bringing civilization with them. Harry wants to use the gold to upgrade Nassau's defenses. Vastly upgrade them. And that since you do be knowing of his magic, there are magical advancements and protections he can bring as well. Leaning forward, Harry spoke for himself once more. This is the Pirate Republic, and I will make sure it lasts. The others shared a long look before nodding as one. We're listening. 2 hours later. Anne returned to Guthrie's pub with a fresh skip in her step. For the first time in years she actually felt free, as if the future laid out before her was finally the one she was supposed to be living instead of one that had been chosen by others. Her afternoon had been quite eventful and productive. She'd met a captain that actively wanted her on his crew, murdered both her cheating husband and sham of a marriage in the same knife slash, and had gone on a massive shopping spree. Now here she was, fully kitted out and with 2 trunks of further clothing and tools being sent back to the Freedom. After so long under pirate occupation, the stores knew well how to send things to ships and make sure they weren't stolen in transit. Captain Harry had said to clothe and supply herself, so that is exactly what she did, and the end result was telling if the number of lustful and envious glances she was getting were anything to go by. Her new outfit consisted of tight pants, leather boots that reached to her knees, a crimson sash around her waist, a buttoned shirt with a frilled collar that was open enough to display a generous helping of her ample breasts. She knew she was attractive and she owned it, and over it all was a long black greatcoat in the style of military officer's dress. On top of that, her hair was held back from her face by a black bandana, and she had 2 pistols and a pair of long hilted knives at her waist. The moment she'd looked in the mirror with the full ensemble, she'd practically fallen in love with herself. It seemed the rest of the pub had as well, and the redhead found herself fending off more than a few overly forward offers for companionship. Please, as if any of these fuckers were worthy of her time. All musing was put on hold, however, as the door to the back room opened and a group of men came out shouting for silence and attention. And noticed at once that her new captain was amongst them and standing beside Benjamin Hornigold as the blond man took center stage and raised a document high for all to see. What followed was a declaration that stunned her. She knew that Nassau was a haven for pirate activities, but to openly declare the small island a pirate republic under the leadership of the head table? And to create a goddamned constitution as well? Things were getting even more interesting than before. Benjamin Hornigold sat on the beach of Nassau drinking rum with Charles Vane. Now that Henry Avery was dead, Charles was the closest to him in power and means, aside from Silent Harry of course, but that young man outstripped both of them in leagues. The lad was just too polite to outright state the fact. For anyone else that would certainly breed rage and envy, but the young man was so generous with his earnings that it was impossible to dislike him. It was that same captain they were discussing now as they passed the bottle back and forth. When Harry said he was going to upgrade this place, I never could have imagined the ways he intended. Vane noted. Aye, buying up, stealing, and making 300 new cannons before installing them around Nassau was one thing, but hunting down 20 new frigates to fish and serve as an outer defense was on a whole other level, Hornigold agreed. For any of us that would have taken years, yet he did it in a matter of months, and Adewale said he has plans to procure even more. Those toilet inventions of his are quite impressive as well. They make latrines and outhouses obsolete. The captain of the Ranger agreed. Shortly after their announcement of the organization of their little republic, Harry had delivered on one of his many promises to the head table. The use of magic to enhance the daily lives of the people of Nassau. First was a potion that apparently cured sexually transmitted diseases. Between that and his rumored performance at Madame Mortentia's, it was no wonder the whores kept asking for him every time he came calling to port. He'd followed up this miraculous gift with what he called hygienic changes and quality of life upgrades. Toilets were ceramic bowls and chamber pots inscribed with runes that disposed of waste as soon as it arrived by simply making it disappear. Public disease had dropped considerably after that. Then came heating chambers that provided everyone with tubs of hot water. Bathing rates had tripled per week for everyone in no time. Then there were the weapon and island defense advancements he'd set into motion. Some of them boggled the mind. On the whole, their tiny little island was rapidly reaching a state of modernity, and if Harry could deliver on some of his other promises too. There has been talk of putting Harry in sole command of the head table. Vane ventured. This rumor had come to him by way of Rackham. If every captain on the island voted that way, then it would be so. After the latest changes he brought, I wouldn't exactly be opposed. The blond man groaned. There is something to be said for someone that keeps their lofty promises. 2 of their seats were now empty. Blackbeard had been on a long hunting voyage for a while now, and last they heard he was heading to Mexico, apparently having received news that one of his many wives, the man was an old horn dog, had apparently given birth to a daughter and he wanted to meet her. Who knew when he'd return from that venture? And Sparrow? No one was entirely sure what had happened to him. He and his crew had gone searching for a mythical Mayan treasure 2 months past, an act that Harry had warned them against, heartily claiming such a thing was surely cursed, and never returned. The end result was putting all the authority on the shoulders of Hornigold, Vane, and Harry. And out of the 3 of them, Harry surely liked it the most. And you would just be okay with that? Him taking the reins? Vane wanted to know. It isn't a stretch to say you built this place. True, but look at where it was with me, and where it is now that Harry has shown up. And it's not like being in charge is that important to me. I just want the freedom to keep raiding and living life on my terms. Can't see Harry getting in the way of that. I'm much the same. Vane took another swig. We gonna introduce him to the new guy? Of course. And speak of the devil. Both men turned to look at the harbor where a telling black flag was coming into view. That was fast. A 2-week voyage this time, wasn't it? He said something about looking for a new galleon called the Orca to add to the island fleet. I wonder if he found it? Well, let's go find out for ourselves. Together the 2 men stood, and let's grab the newbie, Harry will get a kick out of him. The Freedom. As he pulled into the Bay of Nassau, Harry couldn't help but smile. Every time he came back it felt like coming home. And after the clusterfuck that had been his outing, it certainly felt nice to return. As his fingers tightened around the grips of the helm, he felt a surprisingly strong yet supple pair of arms encircle his waist. Now, Captain, a sultry Irish purr buzzed in his ear, what could you possibly have to be anxious about? Smiling warmly at the voice he answered, after how our journey ended, Anne, not a damn thing. 1 week prior. Harry steered the Freedom smoothly through the fog, and for once it wasn't one of his own creation. They'd been hunting a former privateering vessel named the Orca for the last several days, and the trail had led them into this grim twilight. The scoundrels crewing it had been targeting innocent crossing ships transporting families to the New World, so taking them out of circulation to aid immigrants was on even terms in Harry's mind with giving his island an extra measure of defense by adding it to the fleet. He was just about to send Hedwig scouting when he felt something strange. A tremor in his tattoos that connected him to the sea. There was a dark presence ahead, and the ocean did not like it. Straining his ears, Harry heard 2 things that confused him greatly. The swish of a hull retreating into the distance and a distinctly feminine voice singing "A Pirate's Life for Me." Deciding to just handle the situation rather than flounder, Harry raised his hands to the sky and pulled them rapidly apart. 4 things happened at once. First, the fog pulled away like the curtains of a grand stage. Second, the crew took note of a black flag disappearing over the curve of the horizon, too small to make out the particulars. Third, a transport ship with yellow trimming on the sails became readily visible. And fourth, the galleon that the Freedom had been hunting appeared and began to open fire on it. As the screams of the innocent rent through the air, Harry bellowed, "All hands to stations. Starboard cannons roll out on the double and prepare for broadside and boarding." "Aye, sir." The crew scurried about to follow his orders. "I'm coming with you to board." Anne's voice came from behind him, and Harry nodded without taking his eyes off of his target. "I wouldn't dream of keeping you away. Stay with me, though. I want a good knife at my back." "Aye, Captain." Across the deck Adewale called out, "Cannons ready, sir." Brace for turn, Harry roared before cranking the wheel as hard as he could, bringing the starboard cannons into full range. So focused were they on the yellow ship that the Orca hadn't even noticed them yet. By now the civilian craft was listing dangerously, their hull ruptured, and the small number of cannons on their deck no doubt already destroyed if the Orca cannoneers were worth anything. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Fire! The roaring boom of 20 cannons sounded as one, and in the silence that followed responding booms came from the Orca as they attempted to return fire. Rather difficult when the Freedom had aimed specifically for their battery ports, leaving only a couple irons on deck available for use. Front chasers, Harry roared anew as he adjusted course to bring their prow directly toward the enemy craft. There wasn't time at this distance to reload the broadsides, and he'd not yet finished enough space expansion charms for his rapid-fire adjustments. 4 hatches sprung open in the front above the figurehead, and one after the other they pelted the interceptor deck, sowing explosions, death, and discord in their wake. By now they were close enough to make out the individual figures racing across the surface. Hooks and rope. Aye. The men and women of his boarding party cheered as Dobby popped to each and every one of them with a tri-pronged hook and more than enough line to swing over. Handing one to Anne, Harry gestured to the nearby railing. "After you, my dear." Such a gentleman. The redhead smirked as she began twirling the hook to build momentum. "I try." The wizard cranked the wheel to line them up as the vessels drew level with each other, and with a force of his will calmed the sea to keep them still. "All hands, over the side." "Ragger." His crew roared before launching their hooks and lines and swinging over to begin the assault on the rival pirating crew. It wasn't long before Harry and his red-headed knife hand followed. Aboard the transport ship. Weatherby Swan, soon to be Governor Swan of Port Royal, stared at the tragedy that had become his voyage with mixed horror and fascination. Never in his life had he experienced such carnage and fear, yet he could not look away. This whole situation had come about after accepting a new posting to govern a port town in the Caribbean. It had seemed like a grand way to advance his family name and prestige and provide his daughter access to more prestigious marriage opportunities than being the daughter of a minor lord in England. The crossing had gone smoothly for the first few weeks, but then, earlier today, they'd come across the smoking wreckage of another vessel in the sea. It had been his daughter that discovered the only survivor, a dark-haired young lad of her approximate age apparently named William Turner. He passed out shortly after giving his name. Then the worst had happened. The fog around them cleared in an unnatural instant and revealed a pirate ship within cannon range that noticed them at once and immediately began to fire on their position. Without the protection of the fog to block their line of sight, and with no time to get the men to the 10 guns along the topside railing, they were sitting ducks. Honestly, no matter what Captain Norrington said, Weatherby was 2 steps away from ordering his daughter to run to one of the lifeboats to make a run for it when against all odds a second ship flying a black flag had arrived, and started pelting their attacker instead of them. At once Norrington gave the order to lower the sails and make haste, but the barrage of cannon fire had destroyed their rudder, crippled the mast, and decimated their cannons. All they could do was wait, pray for the new ship to be victorious, and hope that they were reasonable enough to take a payment instead of their lives. As he was thinking these things, Captain Norrington himself came to stand beside him and look out over the unfolding scene. "I've given the men orders to arm every man above 12 and prepare for boarding. If violence comes, we are prepared to fight to the last man to protect the women and children." He held out a cutlass to the long-wigged man. "That includes you, my lord." Taking the weapon gingerly, he never had been much of a fighter, Weatherby asked, "Surely we should try talking before resorting to outright violence?" The captain frowned. "That would be ideal, but I have never known pirates to be reasonable people, and that new flag. I've been hearing reports about it for the last few months. It's apparently the personal colors of a man calling himself Silent Harry, a young man by all accounts, yet he has captured more prizes in a shorter time frame than any other captain in these waters, and he's personally murdered more than 20 Navy and East India Company officers in the same amount of time. Why is he called Silent Harry?" Norrington thought about it for a moment. "Those few crew members who managed to be rescued after his assault say he never speaks to those he takes and that his ship comes upon them completely without sound. I'm not sure I believe that last reason, but the same tale has been told enough times to be worrying. I have also heard he is certainly ruthless, but that he is not cruel, unless degraded. From what I understand, he primarily targets slave transports and other ships related to the East India Company, so it is rather strange he would be traveling along this sea route. Well, I would hate to see our menfolk killed in a needless battle." Left unsaid was that he most certainly included himself in that number. "As the leader of this expedition, I will of course parley with this Silent Harry should he prove victorious, and provide whatever I can to get him to leave us in peace. Our material wealth is not worth our lives." "I believe that to be a mistake, my lord." Nevertheless, my decision is final. Captain Norrington visibly ground his teeth at that statement, hating the thought of letting a known pirate just walk up to the deck, but nevertheless he saluted his soon-to-be governor and went back to ready the men. Whatever Swan said, he intended to have his own forces ready for anything. And if he was any judge, then they would need to fight for one of those ships anyway, as their own was practically scuttled in the water. As he continued on his way, he took note of a girl of perhaps 13 in a white dress, staring out at the flashes of cannon and gunfire emanating from the two ships as they drew closer together. It seemed Ms. Swan had a rather unhealthy interest in pirates and violence. Oh well, she was sure to grow out of it. The Freedom. Harry stared at the Orca as it drew close, stepped up to Barbossa and Adwale with Anne at his side, and as one his group launched their lines with the other fighters and swung across the divide as others set up gangplanks to cross once they grew closer yet. By now they had their tactics down to a science, and as his number engaged the body of the enemy crew, Harry and his lot went after the captain and officers. The rationale being that without the head of their crew the body would fall. It was a system that had worked remarkably well in the past. With Khopesh blades in hand, Harry cut a bloody swath through the pirate bodies until he reached the helm, where a concentrated clump of dirty men in far better clothing than the others were set about defending the helm. The wizard could practically feel the contempt of his crew for their slovenly state. Cleanliness on the Freedom was prized and defended highly by them all, especially Maddie, as she saw the alternative as a fast track to new patients. The officers saw them as they barreled up the stairs and seemed to have similar ideas to their own as they charged from their position in force. Harry ducked the wild slash of a thin man with a chipped saber, locked it against the deck with his right blade, and slashed clean through his neck with the left. Anne dispatched her foe with nearly a dozen rapid stabs in the span of 2 seconds, and Adewale cleaved a man near in half with his massive machete. Barbossa, it seemed, had found the captain, based on the stranger's massive tri-cornered hat, and was dueling him rapier to rapier with rapid movements so fast none present could really see them. Of course, all attention to that fight was quickly carried away by their own continued engagements, and Harry found himself trading blows with a large man wielding an axe. Utilizing his greater speed and dexterity, the wizard danced back and forth around the wild man as he rained down counter-slashes and strikes that left his foe coated in sheets of blood from nearly 24 different wounds. Eventually the man couldn't take it anymore, fell to his knees, and died via a Khopesh chop that caved in his skull. Still feeling the high of his latest kill, Harry looked up to check on his friends, only to run forward across the deck screaming, "Anne!" For her part, the red-headed knife hand was busy holding a short brunette tight while slowly slashing her throat when she heard her captain's exclamation. She turned to see what was so important, only to take note of a rifle-wielding Scotsman 12 feet away aiming his weapon at her head. From that close a distance he wouldn't miss. Time seemed to slow. She could practically see his finger tightening on the trigger, and just as she was readying herself for the last-ditch effort of trying to raise her captive in front of her to try and halt the iron ball's path, a new weight crashed into her side as the crack of the shot erupted in the air. And heard a grunt of pain as she and the new weight crashed to the ground. "Son of a bitch," Harry exclaimed, shoving off of her before grabbing his pistol, aiming at her attacker, and setting him on fire with a crimson shot. "Captain." The redhead shoved herself off of the corpse in her arms and rapidly moved her hands over his form, finding the new hole through his left arm. "Don't worry about me," he growled before ripping the sash from his waist to tie firmly around his wound. "Maddie and Dobby will have me healed up in no time. We need to finish off these fuckers first though." Anne was feeling a confusing mix of emotions in that moment. Gratitude for being saved, worry that Harry had taken a bullet for her, an unfamiliar warmth pooling in her core at the look in his eyes as he stared down at her, and anticipation at more slaughter to come. Like all times things got confusing for her, she decided to seize on violence until she had time to deal with it. "Right-o, Captain," she exclaimed before moving off into the fray once more. Meanwhile, Harry stalked over to the still dueling pair of Barbossa and the enemy leader. It was time to end this. His first mate saw him, moved to the side as if to give him room, but Harry was no longer in a dueling mood after getting shot in the arm. The moment he got in range he leveled his pistol on the captain's skull and pulled the trigger. A second later his brains were on the floor. "All right, boys." Harry stomped his boot on the raised platform the helm was positioned on, temporarily halting the chaos below with the pure tone of command in his voice. As all turned to look at him, Harry proclaimed, "These assholes actually shot me. I want them dead to the last man. Make them bleed for this." "Aye." The crew shouted in agreement before surging like a rage-fueled tide back into the enemy. No one, and they meant no one, hurt their captain. What followed was a slaughter that stained the deck red and left a mountain of corpses behind. This crew had been surprisingly well stocked in terms of men and supplies, and the aftermath showed that clearly. When it was all said and done, a great cheer erupted into the air and the looting officially began. As the crew started ferrying over the supplies, Harry was forcefully led back to his ship by Barbossa and Adewale, and Maddie and Dobby fussed all over him for a solid 10 minutes as they extracted the bullet from his arm, cleaned the wound, and sealed it shut with magic and gauze. There would still be a scar, and he'd be tender for a day or two, but there was no lasting damage. Maddie wanted him to stay in the infirmary for observation overnight, but Harry was having none of it. There was still far too much that needed doing to be cooped up Belodex at the moment. Turn your focus to the rest of the wounded. They have more need of your healing skills now than I do. Dobby, could you do something about the bodies and the mess? When both individuals finally gave their agreement to his orders, the annoyed Brit took his leave. Stupid, he had been stupid. Instead of shielding Anne with his body, he should have simply fired off a spell at the shooter right away or erected some kind of magical shield between the two, but when he'd seen her in danger, some part of him just moved on instinct. He hadn't thought clearly. When he was just a simple wizard in England, that was fine enough. Being a dumb hero was expected, but he was a captain now, and the men and women under his command needed him to stay alive. Acting impulsively wasn't in the cards for him anymore. He made it 2 steps onto the deck before he found himself shoved into the wall and a smooth tongue pressed between his lips. His eyes only had enough time to recognize red hair before he closed them and leaned into the embrace. All around them the crew cheered, hooted, and hollered congratulations along with several bawdy suggestions. When Anne finally broke away, she gasped out, "You took a bullet for me." "I did." "Why? Do I need a reason to protect such a beautiful woman?" At her deadpan stare he sighed and added, "This is going to sound strange, and I swear that I will explain it to you fully tonight," but he reached up to run his hand through her hair. "I have dreamed of you for years, Anne. Your beauty, your hair, your smile, and now that you are finally here with me, I could not bear to be parted from you. That gun was poised to take you from me, and I could not have that." "Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it feels right." Anne smirked before resting her forehead against his own. "And I'm still here now, with you." "Yes, but I'm a pirate, Anne, and that means I'm greedy. I want you all to myself. Is that all right? I'm not one for sleeping around when a fine bed is already under me back. That being said, I do like Tasher, so maybe we bring another girl or two round on occasion, eh?" Harry couldn't help laughing at that. History had said Anne Bonny was insatiable, but he'd thought that a sly rumor on the part of the authorities to discredit her character. It seemed that was not the case after all. What kind of man would I be to turn that down? "I can't rightly say, but maybe we should focus on getting things here settled for now, and tonight." Her finger trailed circles around his chest. "You can show me what is so special about that tongue of yours that it has gotten every whore on Nassau so hot and bothered for your company." Blushing slightly at that reminder, the wizard nodded before stepping off the wall. And slid her arm through his own, and together they took off to inspect the progress. 2 hours later the Orca had been stripped of treasure, weapons, and supplies, to the point that it was now a floating husk. The plan to take it as a prize had gone out the window the moment Harry had seen the transport vessel was scuttled, but that didn't make this venture unprofitable with how full the Orca's hold had been. Now it was time to meet the travelers. "All right, people," Harry instructed the men and women occupying the deck of the Freedom as he directed his ship away from the Orca and over to the transport vessel. "Our goal is to be as non-threatening as possible, so let's put our best foot forward. These people are just trying to make a journey and have not yet done anything to cause us insult or harm. Provided they do as instructed, we can send them on their way peacefully." "Aye, Captain." The crew gave him their affirmations, and they were underway. There was a slight moment of worry when several rifles were aimed their way and the men had to duck for safety, but they quickly disappeared when the white flag of Parley came into view. Of course Harry could have disarmed his foes with magic, but it would have been a hassle, and the whole point was to not freak them out. When they finally drew level without being shot or otherwise engaged, a gangplank was lowered, and Harry leaned on his wheel to wait as a party from the other ship slowly made their way over, apparently having anticipated the need for the meeting. The first to appear was a straight-backed man in a crisp uniform, backed by 5 similarly garbed fellows in red coats. Muskets rested over shoulders within easy reach, but none had yet to be drawn. The men fanned out in an arch behind their leader, providing a complete half-circle of protection over the plank for an aristocratic man with a very large wig to follow. He was trying hard to look as impressive as possible, but the military fellow achieved the look with far more effect than he did. I say," the wigged man set himself in place with a heavily detailed cane smacking the wood by his feet, "and might I have a word with the captain of this vessel?" If he hadn't been so clearly nervous, then his demeanor would have been hilarious. As it was, Harry had had enough fighting for that day, so he waved his first mate forward. Barbossa bowed low with a sweep of his hat. I be Hector Barbosa, first mate to Captain Harry, and we welcome you to the Freedom. Yes, the officer noted dryly, your welcome was very loud and clear. I assume this is Silent Harry you speak of based on your flag? Aye. He do be by the wheel. Harry waved sarcastically from his position. With the elevation difference of the helm he was positioned above everyone else. James Norrington's first impulse was to scoff at the idea of someone so young commanding such an intimidating force, and a mob of clearly escaped slaves was intimidating indeed, but he'd received enough reports about what the man did to those who commented on his age so he managed to reel himself in. Instead he said, might we speak to him directly? This is a matter of parley after all. The wizard nodded and stepped down from the helm to wander over beside his first mate. He waved, and Barbosa said, you may speak. The minor lord took in the youth before him and marveled at what he saw. Pirates were supposed to be dirty, grungy, unorganized, uneducated, and altogether the dredges of society. This person was none of those things. He was remarkably clean, in fact every person present was as well. Strange that. Honestly, the hygiene amongst these black fellows was more present than amongst many of his fellow passengers. His arms were bare, revealing incredibly intricate tattoos, but his clothing was all well made and he stood with poise and presence equal to any naval officer he'd ever met. No person that young should be so intimidating in his opinion. Silent Harry, he finally managed to get his voice under control, he really wasn't built for tense situations. I am here to negotiate for the safe passage of he was cut off by the slicing motion of the captain's hand. Harry leaned over to whisper in Hector's ears and spoke his message. The captain do be saying you have nothing to negotiate. Now see reason, I'm sure we have enough money too. Interrupting again the pirate added, because we do not be intending to halt your voyage. Weatherby's eyes grew large and even Norrington blinked with surprise. Excuse me? You are not slavers, your passengers are not part of the navy, or a prize worth taking. We have already emptied the Orca of its valuables and that is more than enough riches for this trip. Silent Harry has no urge to rob those simply starting new lives. Provided ye do be handing over your weapons as a show of good faith, we will allow you all to board the craft we have just captured and sail her to your destination with enough provisions to make the journey. In the shocked silence that followed, a young female voice cut in, but why? You're pirates, aren't you? Why would you show us this kindness? All eyes turned back to the gangplank where the openly gawking form of Elizabeth Swann was now standing. Elizabeth. Weatherby tried to corral his daughter back across the distance at once, but she nimbly dodged him before ducking past Norrington and running across the deck to stand right in front of Harry with her arms crossed, determined to stand her ground. Several of the Freedom's crew members stepped forward as if to intercept the young girl, but Harry waved them off as he stared the stranger in the eye. When he continued to say nothing she said, pirates attacked us, and they sank a ship that carried a new friend of mine for no reason. Why would you do different? Shocking everyone, Harry smiled, and actually spoke. It was a great shock to Elizabeth to find out that he was English. What is your name? Elizabeth Swann. My name is Harry. Tell me, Miss Swann, are all people the same? What? No, of course not. Then why would you assume all pirates are the same? He smiled knowingly at the girl. Those people who attacked you and your friend were as much our enemies as yours. Men who live only by their greed and desire to cause pain. My crew and I, though also greedy in our own ways, stand for something different, something more. Elizabeth had snuck over to this big ship intent on doing what her father wouldn't and giving this man a piece of her mind, but she found herself now absolutely entranced by his aura of confidence and command, as well as his words. There was just something powerful about him, and for some reason she couldn't quite explain, she liked it. Of course it helped that he was absolutely gorgeous in a way she'd never seen from the gentry of England. More rugged and worldly. What is it that you stand for? Freedom. Hence the name of my ship. Look around you, nearly everyone under my flag would have been enslaved to serve another against their will without our intervention. It's a barbaric and horrible practice that your king openly approves of and profits from. Elizabeth cringed at the thought. She knew theoretically that slavery existed, but she'd never seen it practiced in her home in England, so the prospect had seemed more theoretical than reality. But looking across the deck of the ship and seeing all those faces that would have been subjected to such a life, she found herself utterly ashamed to be from a country that allowed the practice. I too was a slave once, Harry continued, and I cannot abide its application. My people and I sail where we wish, raid when we wish, free whomever we can, and live the lives we choose to live. That is what we stand for. Your people on that ship are innocent. You have not harmed us and you have not enslaved anyone, so of course we have no need or desire to harm you. He took her hand and gently brought the back of it to his lips. I wish you only the best in life going forward. You might even remember today as the day that pirate saved your life. I will. Elizabeth scuffed her shoe, suddenly ashamed of the vitriol she'd marched in with. Thank you so much. That other ship scared me. I thought I was going to die, but then you showed up. Her eyes raked over the gathered crowd. You all showed up. Thank you too. She curtsied to the crew, who chuckled to a man and nodded back at her. That's enough, Elizabeth. Weatherby stepped forward, grabbed his daughter's hand, and pulled her back behind the line of soldiers. If you mean what you say, and we are free to go, then we will take our leave. Of course. A boat with foodstuffs will be sent to you and you may keep it as a way to shuttle passengers to the new ship. As the civilians began to move back, Norrington stayed to look the pirate captain in the eye. This one good deed does not redeem you from the life of wickedness you lead. Someday you will be captured and hanged. If I am lucky it will be by my own hand. Let's agree to disagree. After all, I'm on the side that frees men. You, on the other hand, are on the side that puts them in chains. Norrington didn't really have a response to that, and it stung his pride to realize it. So he simply spun on his heels and marched back the way he'd come. 20 minutes later the Freedom was moving back onto the open sea, and Elizabeth and the other passengers were being safely shuttled over to the Orca. The journey to their new home was once more in sight. The present. Nassau. True to her words, Anne had indeed come to his cabin that night, and by God had she been amazing. He wasn't sure how it was possible, but an entire room of willing women on Nassau had not compared to her singular enthusiasm. The woman was downright insatiable. Afterward they'd had a more thorough conversation about how they felt about each other. He'd explained where he really came from, and together they had decided to officially become a couple. Neither were much for playing games, and they liked each other far too much to stop what they'd begun. Now that they had made it back to the island, though, it was time to make their way back to shore with their spoils. As had become their habit, the entire crew moved to the boats and made for the beach. Dobby made a request for a goat to cook, and with that the ship was secure. Once on land the crew began unloading the cargo, and it was there that Hornigold and Vane arrived. Harry. The blonde drew his fellow head table member into an exuberant side hug and examined his wares. This is a glorious haul, and those cannons are sure to be put to good use, but weren't you planning to bring back a ship? The wizard shrugged. I found others that needed it more than we do, surprisingly enough. His gaze turned to Vane and the stranger that was standing beside him watching his crew with interest. And who is that? A newbie to the island, James Kidd. Apparently he's the bastard son of that old scallywag William Kidd. As a legacy we thought we'd show him around and introduce him to some people. Son of William Kidd? That didn't make any sense. Kidd hadn't had a son as far as he knew, and his reading on the man was extensive. Plus, there was something strange about the new guy. Looking closer he took note of the slight and angular features, heavier than normal grime on his face and neck, no longer common in Nassau. The overly bulky if well-made clothing that hid a great deal of his body shape, and most telling of all, the lack of an Adam's apple on his neck. That last only visible through the grime if you were actively looking for it. Now that he thought about it, wasn't there a famous pirate that had notoriously cross-dressed as a man several times during her career? Well, she may have fooled the rest, but she wouldn't fool him. Hiding the hungry smirk that threatened to grow on his face with great force of will, he said, I'll just go say hello. Smirking conspiratorially at Anne, he walked over to the newbie and leaned down to whisper in his, know her, ear, hello there, Mary Read. Why are we out here again? James Kidd, or Mary Read as Harry knew her to really be, asked her new captain as he rotated the helm to carry them through a rather large swell. 4 days prior he'd whispered her true name in her ear and the only thing he'd asked in return for keeping her secret was for her to join his crew. Considering she had been wanting to do so anyway, that hadn't really been a problem. Everyone she'd met had said Silent Harry's ship was the one to join if you truly wanted to make a name for yourself in a hurry. Even back in her hometown in England she'd heard of Silent Harry, Barbossa, and Ottawale, and they had inspired her own turn to piracy. It seemed if one spent enough time knocking over East India Company ships and trade routes they were bound to get famous. Especially in a country like her own where that same company practically ran the ship, as it were. That being said, it was a little discouraging that she'd been found out so fast. Luckily it seemed only Harry had been that quick on the uptake, though he had said he intended to let Anne and Barbossa know, and she was soon enough just another one of the guys amongst the crew. There were not yet any truly famous female pirates in the West, and she refused to let her gender ruin her chances of fame. So if she had to pretend to be a man, then that was what she would do. Her answer came as Harry adjusted the wheel a slight degree to straighten them back out. Simple. I want to bring more magic to Nassau. I have an idea for how to really shake things up, but I need more skilled mages to offer a hand. I'm powerful, but I'm far from a god. Right, magic is real. Mary was still having a hard time wrapping her head around that little fact. But why are we going to America to find them? Wouldn't we have more luck looking in England, since we're from there? Harry sighed and shook his head. There are a couple reasons we won't go there. First, I really don't like England. I only have bad memories there. Second, English wizards are incredibly stuck up where I come from, and tend to see non-magical folk as beneath them. I can't imagine I'll be able to find people who think differently now. Third, from what I recall, mages in America haven't had the best lot in life at this point. Between witch burnings and a general need to hide who and what they are, something that would get under anyone's skin, if we can find a clump of them, I'll bet they'll likely be all too willing to go somewhere they can freely perform magic in the open. To go somewhere they'll be celebrated instead of reviled. A conniving grin came to his face as he finished, and once they're on Nassau I can make use of their power for my own designs. Mwahahahahaha. His head tilted with his laugh and that large feather in his hat tipped back to touch his shoulder as a result. Mary sighed as Anne burst out laughing at the man's actions. The redhead was lounged languidly on a nearby railing sipping from a mug of beer. Harry, darling, I'm sorry, but you really can't pull off the evil laugh. Stick to the menacing silence, it works far better for you. Right, sorry. The feared captain of men turned back to the sea and actually began to sulk. You try something new one time, he mumbled. Then he said much louder, besides, I'm a very good people person. I'm sure they'll listen to me. That set him off even more and the sulking returned with full force as the ship carried on its way. That evening, just past normal dinner time for most people, the Freedom pulled up to the docks in the port of Boston. Even at this late hour the place was bustling with all manner of trading craft and other much larger vessels. Amongst this throng of humanity, with the black flag lowered, their own ship went mostly unnoticed as they paid a dock rental fee and a little extra to keep their names off the official books. All right, Mary, you're with me. Adewale, look after the crew, seriously, keep an eye on them. We don't have writs of freedom for them, so there is a chance they could be legally arrested and sold back into slavery if they're caught. Barbossa, look after the ship. I don't want Dobby's magic catching too much attention here where there's still such a strong naval presence. Aye, Captain. The quartermaster and the older man's voices answered in unison. Looking down the line to the redhead who was nearly vibrating with excitement at finally getting to explore somewhere new again, Harry ordered, Anne. Don't cause too much trouble, and save a pint for me. Yay. And pulled her man forward to hug his face into her enviable, in Mary's opinion, chest before rushing off into the crowd. The entire crew sweat dropped at the sight and Barbossa offered, Ye do realize we'll be needing to pull her tight ass out of some fire or other later on? Of course. Harry answered. But that's just Anne, and I like her that way. Without another word he spun on his heels and took off as the brunette crossdresser hurried on to follow. With Harry. 2 hours. That was how long it took to track down the magical district of Massachusetts. Each state had one in the future, but this was the easiest to reach by the captain's estimation. Turns out they'd hidden the passage behind the biggest church in the city. Kind of ironic when one thought about it, but honestly, who would suspect practitioners of the arcane to be moving to and fro over hallowed ground? Once he made it through the barriers, he took a moment to enjoy the look of awe on Mary's face. Had his own been that awestruck all those years ago in Diagon Alley? This is insane. The brunette breathed as she stared out at the spectacle before them. It seemed the magical denizens here had taken their oppression as a challenge because their personal space was magical as hell. Every cobble in the street was of a different outlandish shape and color. The homes and shops lining the path were of sizes and proportions that should not have made any structural sense, and throughout the visible air enchanted notes, books, and items floated past in arcs likely leading from one person to another. On the whole, magical Massachusetts was a clusterfuck, and the pirates loved every bit of it. For a while the two of them perused the enclosed neighborhood and took note of how relatively empty it was. At most there were maybe 40 families in the area based on the number of homes and children running around on the street, and there were 5 or 6 shops spread out here and there with a small bank and a pub spread between. Clearly a little overawed by everything she was seeing, Mary still managed to note, "This is amazing, Harry, but isn't it a little empty here? I expected a large swarm of people if this is the heart of their society." Who said this is the heart? Harry wondered. As far as I know the Makusa will form in New York at some point, so that is likely where the majority of the magical population is concentrated. This is simply the folk who live here. There weren't a lot of us when I grew up, so I can only imagine how few there are now. My books say on average there are only 42 magicals out of every 1 million people, so to find any amount of them in numbers is rather impressive. They were earning some strange looks now as they walked on down the path, and why not? It wasn't every day the average person saw a man with androgynous features walking around in a long coat, breeches, and a frilled neckerchief, or another fellow in a sleeveless vest, a wide-brimmed hat with a feather, and arms absolutely coated in tattoos. They're starting to stare, boss. What's the plan? Simple, Mary, we're going to address as many people as possible and make our offer. And what's the best way to do that? By going where the people are, my sweet new crew member. The wizard smirked her way and Mary couldn't help the slight flutter in her stomach at that action. It was unfair how charming the dimples of his smile looked. And where would that be? She cut off as they ducked under the sign of the only pub in the magical district. Of course. As she watched, the eyes following them turned into a crowd that quickly swarmed behind the new strangers into the dimly lit space where her captain had apparently conjured a table and a chair with which to sit behind it. A moment later he also had a sign that read, "America kind of sucks right now. Change my mind." Underneath it in a different script was stated, "New opportunities and chances for growth in Nassau." A chorus of murmurs erupted at the sign and Mary ended up palming her face. Harry was so going to get her stabbed. With Anne. And Bonnie hadn't really had a plan for when she got off the ship, but she knew she wanted to explore, and she also knew her man wouldn't have a problem with that desire. Hell, that was why he was her man in the first place. All her life men had tried to control her. To turn her to their desires and the futures they deemed appropriate and just. Not Harry though. No, from the moment he had made her acquaintance he had only ever expected and desired her to be herself and live as freely as she saw fit. Even on the ship he only expected her to follow the orders every other man did when they were underway. Otherwise she was free to do as she would. As she meandered down the streets and tried to get some measure of control over her stroll once more, adjusting back to land-sucked ass. Damn sea legs, and took notice of all the eyes following her and smirked. Why wouldn't they be checking her out? She was fine as hell and she knew it. Red hair, a chest to die for, muscular legs and an outfit that showed off her assets to the fullest. Men clearly wanted her, but they wouldn't get her. Harry was the only one for her, who could even try to compare to him. Women stared at her with envy and dislike and she just stuck her tongue back out at them. Dusty Bints were probably just pissed they had to weigh themselves down with all those layers of fabric and skirts while she could walk freely in her trusty pants. After a while she decided that a drink was what the evening called for and she ducked into a tavern with blue-tinged windows to buy herself a drink. Meanwhile across the street a pair of men in the red uniforms of the British military held up a broadsheet showing the hand-drawn image of a pirate named Anne Bonny. Beneath the image was a written-out description as well as a promised reward for information leading to her capture. Murtaugh, the first man said, "I'm telling you, I think that's her. Think about it, red hair, wears pants, bandana through the hair, and twin long knives." What, and no other woman could ever wear pants. That's not what I'm saying and you know it. Of course women could wear pants. Not that they should, but they could. I am merely pointing out the statistical improbability of a woman wearing pants as well as having that color hair and keeping a pair of big knives in her clear possession, and not being Anne Bonny. Yeah, you might be onto something, Mulroy. The other man agreed. You stay here and make sure she doesn't leave. I'll go and get the city watch. The way he saw it there was no real downside here. On the off chance it really was the dreaded knife hand of Silent Harry's crew then he and Geoffrey stood to earn a rather substantial reward. Perhaps even enough to purchase a pair of lieutenant's positions. And if it was just some random civilian, then the only harm caused was rousing the damned locals out of their bunks. No harm or foul to the king's military either way. With Barbossa and Adewale. The crew had been too nervous to go ashore with Harry's warning, so had elected to stay in their quarters. With the upgraded expansion runes that space was rather large and the crew of 280 men and women, the number having grown over numerous raids on East India Company vessels, had plenty of room to meander about. Some were playing card games that their captain had introduced them to, others were studying their letters, an instructor had been convinced to work on the ship with the promise of his weight in gold once the entire crew was literate, and even more were playing an interesting game called soccer. Harry had introduced it as a way to keep the crew fit, and every one of them had fallen in love with the sport right away. It had gotten to the point that small teams had formed between their number and they regularly scrimmaged each other, each coached by one of the officers of course. Once Harry explained the rules they were all eager to gain some victory. The winners got bragging rights, special desserts, and extra cups of grog or rum at dinner. Ironically enough, Dobby's team seemed to win more often than not. The others suspected the elf gave his players extra meat to prepare them but couldn't prove it. Right now though the teams weaving the ball around a fake patch of grass beneath the swinging ceiling lamps were those of Barbossa and Adewale. The game had been going for a while now and it was down to the deciding point that would crown the winner. Brace up yards, ye runners and bilge rats. The first mate bellowed at his forward attacker as she ran the ball across the field with her mates running wings of defense. Tonight's rum be a goal worth scoring for. Aye, sir. They screamed back. Meanwhile, Adewale was waving his arms ecstatically at his own people, urging them back to defend the goal and get ready for a counterattack to reclaim the ball. It wasn't to be, however. Barbossa's attacker weaved nimbly between the others and drove her leg forward, scoring the last goal of the game to momentous applause. A moment later mugs of alcohol appeared in the winner's hands and Dobby began to pop back and forth distributing slices of fruit and cups of water to everyone else. The little guy took the care of the crew seriously after all. Congratulations, all. Cheers. Barbossa chugged his own mug and the others followed before he made his way over to Adewale and offered a hand. It'd be a good game we just had. Aye. Though we'll take the win next time. Only if ye aren't playing Dobby's boys. The two of them laughed lightly before making their way up to the deck for some air. The sea breeze was certainly calming after all of that exertion. At least, that was the intent until they took note of a disturbance on the other side of the docks. It seemed a contingent of City Watch were marching in single file down the street and into the town. Odd that. Barbossa sighed at the sight. How much do ye want to bet that has something to do with either our captain or Anne? The bigger man crossed his arms and answered, not a thing. I am not a fool, Barbossa. What should we do? Gather a landing crew. We'll head in quick and see what's happening and deal with it if necessary. Understood. With Harry. America is our home. Yet you cannot live freely and openly. In Nassau all people are accepted. I can promise you that your magic need not be shamed or hidden as long as you reside on our shores. Mary spoke calmly, having been coached by her captain on the arguments she was likely to receive. We have built lives here. New lives can also be built. She shot back. What do you really have to gain here? Where can you or your family go that you have not already been? There are no prospects for your kind in all practicality. A wizened older woman stepped to the front of the crowd and glared down at the still-seated Harry, his hat turned down with his head and casting his face in shadow. You've not spoken yet, young man, yet it is clear this is your presentation. No one does something as big as offering to relocate an entire settlement without an ulterior motive. Why don't you stop telling us the benefits of Nassau and actually explain why you want a bunch of magicals there in the first place? What do you need us to do that you can't do yourself? Slowly the hat raised and sparkling green eyes locked with those of her own. Speaking slowly he asked, what's your name? Miriam Marsh, I'm the mayor of this hamlet. Well, Miriam, magical manpower is one reason. There are only so many objects I can enchant and so many runes I can carve on my own. But there is a very particular spell I want to cast and I'm not powerful enough on my own to cast it over an entire island. And that spell is? Have you ever heard of the Fidelius charm? The entire room gasped. The spell that hides a location from all detection except by those who already know where it is, Miriam whispered. Aye. But no one has ever cast it over an area larger than 2 acres. Hence the need for more magicals. If I can join your power to mine, if only for an instant, I can completely cut off my home from any attacking force that would ever come to claim it. Miriam held a quick conference with her people before coming back. What would be our accommodations on the island? With Anne. Out of the open window of a particular pub mirroring the harbor came the sudden clear sound of a woman's melodious voice joined soon by the uproarious chorus of the other patrons. Bugger off you bastards, bugger off. Fuck you. Bugger off you bastards, bugger off. Like a herd of bloody swine who refuse to leave the trough. You'll get no more this evening. So you bastards bugger off. You've been a lovely audience but now your time is past. Now don't you all be letting the door hit you in the ass. You've been a splendid audience. But enough is enough. We'd thank you very kindly if you'd all just bugger off. Here's to all the thievin' waitresses. Been serving you your beer. They've put up with your noxious breath and stupid drunken leers. Be leaving all your money on the table when you go. Tomorrow you'll have a throbbing head with nothing else to show. Bugger off you bastards, bugger off. Fuck you. Bugger off you bastards, bugger off. The garrison troops summoned forth to execute an arrest warrant didn't know what to make of all this noise, so they simply marched in through the door and beheld a sight even stranger than the music. The entire crowd was cheering, singing, and roaring with delight as they waved their mugs in the air toward a red-headed Irishwoman prancing along the bar, belting out lyrics at the top of her lungs, and waving 2 mugs of beer in the air, one in either hand. "Silence!" the commandant of the guard exclaimed, quieting the rambunctious mass in an instant. Focusing on the woman standing on the bar, he said, "And Bonnie, by my authority granted by the King of England, I am placing you under arrest for theft, murder, and high seas piracy." The redhead glared down at the man who had interrupted her fun as well as the 20 or so guards he'd brought with him. "Me? Under arrest? Seriously? Men, forward." The guards began pushing through the throngs of drunken sailors and dockworkers to little effect. "Do you not know who me captain is?" Anne scoffed. "You do this and there will be serious consequences. Hell, if by some miracle you actually manage to touch me, then you, your men, your garrison, and your manhoods are all done for." The shuffling of the troops ceased suddenly as a fresh voice intoned, "Aye, that be true." All eyes turned back to the door where a truly imposing sight now stood. Barbossa and Adewale were shoulder to shoulder and each was holding 2 pistols in their hands while 40 or so of their crew members hung back with rifles at the ready. "Now, do ye be wanting to fall back, or get to the shooting? Keeping in mind of course that we've got the drop on you and more firepower." The commandant glared at the new intruder and commanded, "Men, prepare to open fire." Clearly not liking this order, his men complied nonetheless, pulling their firearms free. Barbossa blinked. "Seriously? We do not negotiate with pirates," the officer returned. "Nor do we allow them to offer terms. We are godly, law-fearing men, and as such God will judge us the winners here. Now fire." He was cut off as Anne screamed into the air, "Another round for the entire bar if someone knocks that fucker's lights out." A moment later and the commandant was on the floor. Standing tall over him was a burly dockhand who appeared suddenly sheepish at all the attention he was receiving. "Free booze? Free booze!" Anne proclaimed, earning a raucous cheer from the entire populace. She quickly tossed a pouch of gold to the bartender and hopped over several pairs of heads to land beside her first mate. "Thanks for coming, boss." "No problem," Barbossa responded as he watched the guard members lower their weapons, pick up their leader, and back away slowly. At least they seemed to know a doomed fight when they saw one. "I believe the captain did tell ye not to make too big of a fuss? What's revelry without a wee bit of fuss?" And shot back. "Besides, it all worked out, so let's get on back to the ship. Who knows, the boss might have already finished his task and be waiting for us." As one, the group marched back over to the ship, not caring at all that a couple of guards were still following them. It was probably just to keep the dangerous pirates in their sights, and really, what were they going to do? By the time they were on board it would take several ships firing simultaneously to have even a chance of sinking them, and these fools only had muskets and there were just 2 of them. It was a swift walk, and when they arrived Harry was indeed back at the ship at the head of a rather large group of strangers. He had just enough time to wave before Anne was leaping across the distance and throwing herself into his arms. "Hey, Harry, guess what? I sang a bar ballad, got held up by the local constabulary, and almost started a brawl." The young man laughed heartily and kissed his woman. "Sounds like a great time. I only wish I was there to see it." Looking at Barbossa and Adewale he added, "Thanks for looking after her. You guys want to meet our newest recruits?" At their nods he waved graciously to the Americans, "Meet the Magicals of Massachusetts. I couldn't get them all to come, but I found my fair share of curious travelers. Now onward people. We have an island to secure." 2 weeks later. The actual trip back to Nassau had not taken long at all, and the rest of the wait had been spent carving runic schemes into large rocks and placing them at all the cardinal points of the island. Now several wizards were gathered at each one, and as the population of the Pirate Republic watched with interest, Harry stood in front of a central stone and reached out with his awareness, grasping the magical potential of each wizard one by one as the Black Family Tomes instructed. With each acquisition his mental and magical strength doubled, tripled, quadrupled, and continued to grow greater in leaps and bounds. He could not maintain such growth for long without tearing his body apart, but it was not necessary to do so. He only needed to last until there. He'd gained the magical might of every single passenger he'd brought with him from the New World. Cutting off his climb for power he forced his will to level out and hold its current plateau, waiting to say the word that would set the wave of his power free. It was time. Opening his eyes he glared directly at Barbossa as he stood at his customary place beside him. The island of Nassau is located at 25.0443 degrees north, 77.3504 degrees west. Now you are the secret keeper of this spell. It will be up to you to choose trustworthy captains and navigators to inform as well so that they may come and go. I am trusting you with the lives of every person on this island. Can you handle the responsibility, Hector? I do be honored for the trust, Captain. Harry grinned wryly as the strain of so much compressed magic began to pound the space behind his eyes. Then so mote it be. Fidelius. A visible wave of light cascaded off of his body through the gathered crowd, and across the entirety of Nassau and its bay. When it finally faded into the night, the island had disappeared from the knowledge of mortal men. The present. Tia Dalma opened her eyes and found herself standing in a dark chamber absolutely full to bursting with shelves of books and dark covered lights hanging from the ceiling. A library? Well, she certainly wasn't in Cuba any longer, so where was she now? Though her senses were dimmed in her mortal body, she could feel the pull of the sea. England then. She was pulled out of her musings by a popping sound below. Turning down her eyes, she beheld an ancient-looking version of Dobby looking upon her with unrestrained awe. Great mistress. It wheezed as it struggled to kneel before her on brittle knees. Mistress of magic. Mistress of waves. Mistress of chaos. How did this one be serving you? The bound goddess smiled. It was so nice when creatures knew their place in the world. Seal the building and prevent all forms of magical travel. I do be having a need for the people inside. The big-eared creature stared into the distance for a moment before nodding slowly. It be done, mistress. Excellent. The goddess purred as she began strutting for the door. It was time to find someone she could convince to search out her anchors. At this point in time their guardians were all long dead and gone, so the objects should be simple to retrieve. And once they were dealt with, well, she could feel the sea crying out in pain from what humanity had done to it all these years. Some well-deserved vengeance needed to be meted out.